Listen carefully. What you're about to hear was never meant to survive. In the summer of 1851, a single entry in a slave trader's ledger became the crack in a wall the powerful spent centuries building. A notation so strange, so anatomically impossible, that even medical men refused to acknowledge it. The line read only, one specimen. Age 19. Unique physical characteristics. That was all. But the truth hidden behind those 4 words would destroy a family, collapse a plantation, and expose the sickness pulsing at the heart of a civilization built on domination. They called the place Belmont Estate, 30,000 acres of tobacco and ghosts. The kind of wealth that smelled like sugar, blood, and silence. Its master, Thomas Rutland, had everything a man of his era was told to desire: land, reputation, control. But inside that red brick mansion, something had begun to rot. His wife, Catherine, pale and distant since the death of their child, spent her days staring out at the fields, waiting for something to break the stillness. Thomas, meanwhile, had started to feel the edges of his own emptiness. A power without purpose is a curse, and he could feel that curse coiling tighter each year. Then, one August morning, a wagon arrived carrying what history tried to erase: a slave who was both male and female, an impossibility that should not have existed. The trader called the person Jordan. To Thomas it was a curiosity. To Catherine it was an answer. To both, it would become an infection. An idea too potent to control. The moment Thomas looked into Jordan's eyes, he felt it. The rupture of everything he believed to be true about order, nature, and ownership. That's how it always begins. Not with violence, but with fascination. The forbidden doesn't shout, it whispers. And once you hear that whisper, you can't unhear it. Within weeks, the Rutlands' lives became a mirror of the world that created them. Built on control, destroyed by desire. Every night, behind those shuttered windows, they descended deeper into an obsession that defied gender, class, and God himself. What happened next would never be written in any official record. But traces remain. In burned letters, in sealed rooms, in the way people still refuse to speak of Belmont Estate after dark. Because what took root there wasn't just sin. It was revelation. And revelation in the wrong hands always demands a price. There's something you need to understand before we go further. The story of Belmont isn't just about one family's collapse. It's about how power feeds on curiosity until it becomes hunger. In 1851, curiosity was a privilege reserved for the ruling class. They dissected the world to prove they were chosen to rule it. Science was their theology, hierarchy their scripture. And when Thomas Rutland saw Jordan, this living contradiction, he saw not a person but a key, a way to unlock the mystery of control itself. That night, as thunder rolled across the fields, Thomas opened his journal and began the first of many entries he would later burn. His handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost reverent. Subject displays symmetrical features. Ambiguity absolute. Condition appears congenital. He wrote as though describing an experiment, not a soul. But his pen betrayed him. The words grew unstable, the observations more personal, until the line between fascination and possession dissolved. Every empire begins with men who believe they are studying what they are actually consuming. Catherine felt it too. The stillness that had haunted her for years was replaced by a terrible, electric awareness. When she first saw Jordan, standing silent in the cottage light, she felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. In that moment, envy and awe became indistinguishable. To her, Jordan was beauty stripped of category, purity stripped of morality. The forbidden made flesh. She wanted to understand it, and by understanding, own it. Within days, Jordan was moved into the main house. Officially, to serve as Catherine's personal attendant. Unofficially, to live at the crossroads of her and Thomas's obsession. The servants whispered, but no one dared ask questions. They had learned that in places like Belmont, curiosity kills not only the cat, but the entire lineage. By the end of September, the estate's routines had decayed. Fields went untended. Ledgers remained blank. Guests stopped visiting. The house itself seemed to breathe differently, like something inside it was awake now. At night, Catherine would light a single candle in the third floor room and call for Jordan. Sometimes Thomas joined. Sometimes he watched from the doorway, unable to turn away. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The rustle of silk, the murmur of forbidden words, the sound of a soul being divided and studied by those who believed they could own what they didn't understand. Belmont was no longer a home. It had become an altar. Power always disguises itself as curiosity at first, but once the question becomes possession, the descent begins. By October of 1851, Belmont was no longer governed by logic or law. It was governed by appetite. The master and mistress of the estate had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. In that third-floor room, beneath candlelight that flickered like judgment, the boundaries between master and subject, male and female, body and symbol, dissolved completely. Thomas told himself he was conducting study, a rational examination of nature's rarest anomaly. Yet when his hands trembled over the page, it was not reason that guided him. It was need. His journal entries shifted from anatomical notes to questions that revealed the fracture of his own identity. What is purity if not the illusion of separation? He wrote, if the soul has no gender, then what have we built our dominion upon? He didn't know it, but he was dismantling the theology of his own supremacy line by line. Catherine's descent was quieter, but deeper. The fragile woman who once wilted under the expectations of her class now found herself consumed by something she couldn't name. She began dismissing servants without cause, locking herself in her rooms for days. She ordered new garments for Jordan, silks and linens cut to blur the line between servant and sovereign. Sometimes, she would have Jordan read aloud to her from the Bible, then tear out the verses that condemned confusion. She said she was liberating scripture from men's interpretations. But what she was really doing was writing her own gospel of possession. The enslaved people of Belmont knew something monstrous was forming behind those walls. They began refusing to enter the main house after dark. They whispered that the master had brought something unnatural onto the land, something that had unbalanced the air itself. Livestock grew restless. Tools rusted overnight. Even the hounds refused to approach the cottage where Jordan had first been housed. Every night, the mansion seemed to exhale more heavily. The walls sweated, the mirrors fogged, and in that suffocating stillness, Thomas began to see his own reflection blur, his face merging with Jordan's in the candlelight. Catherine saw it too, but she didn't recoil. She smiled. She whispered that maybe this was what divinity truly looked like. Neither male nor female, neither master nor slave. By November, Belmont had stopped functioning as an estate. It had become a temple of confusion, an experiment in human power turned ritual of decay. By the first frost of 1851, the boundaries of Belmont were no longer physical. They were psychological. The estate had become a sealed world, pulsing with its own private gravity. The outside world, neighbors, markets, the church in Farmville, had faded into irrelevance. Thomas no longer attended meetings of the county magistrates. Catherine stopped writing letters. What mattered was only what happened inside those walls, between the three of them, master, mistress, and the enslaved being who had become something far more dangerous than either of them understood. Jordan had learned to move like silence itself, every step measured, every word calculated. There was no rebellion, no open defiance. But beneath that stillness, there was awareness, a depth that frightened both Thomas and Catherine in ways they could not name. They mistook it for docility, but it was something else. It was consciousness studying its captors. Jordan had seen what power did when it no longer needed witnesses. And power, once it discovers its own reflection, always begins to cannibalize itself. At night, the rituals deepened. Thomas's journal transformed into scripture. His handwriting grew darker, his language more exalted. The union of opposites reveals the true nature of dominion, he wrote. Perhaps God himself was a fusion, perfectly divided, eternally whole. He began to speak in symbols, drawing circles and triangles in the margins of his ledgers. Catherine followed, claiming the visions were divine, that Belmont had been chosen as a vessel for revelation. In reality, it was madness. Systematic, methodical madness. But there's a thin line between revelation and insanity, and the powerful often cross it believing they've found truth. The slaves whispered that the master and mistress were practicing witchcraft. They saw candles burning at all hours, heard strange sounds from the upper floors, half prayer, half invocation. Harriet, the old cook, tried to warn the others to stay away. Something's been invited here, she whispered, and it don't belong to this world. But no one could leave. They were bound to that land by law and by fear. Thomas began sleeping less. He'd wake in the middle of the night to find Catherine, standing beside Jordan's bed, eyes unfocused, whispering fragments of Genesis. Sometimes she would touch Jordan's face as though confirming a prophecy. Sometimes she wept. Thomas never stopped her. He only watched, trembling, as the line between worship and discretion dissolved. Belmont had become its own scripture now, a living parable of obsession, power, and the collapse of the human soul before its own creation. By December, the first snow had fallen across Southside Virginia, covering the barren fields like a shroud. But inside Belmont, the air was stifling, heavy with heat and decay. No one dared light a fire in the great hall anymore. The hearth had gone cold the night Jordan began speaking back. It wasn't defiance, just truth spoken too clearly for Thomas and Catherine to bear. One night, Thomas demanded Jordan recite the verses he'd memorized from the plantation's old prayer book. Halfway through, Jordan stopped, lifted their gaze, and said softly, "If your God made me, then what does that make him?" The silence that followed cracked something deeper than the question itself. It was the first moment either Rodold understood that Jordan was not their experiment. They were Jordan's revelation. Catherine wept that night, not from guilt but from awe. "You're not a mistake," she whispered to Jordan. "You're the proof." From that moment on, her devotion became worship. She no longer saw herself as mistress, nor Thomas as master. She began calling Jordan the balance, as though naming the divine principle she had been starved to touch. Thomas oscillated between disgust and dependence. His power, the one thing that defined him, was slipping away, but he couldn't stop watching. He began questioning whether the world outside Belmont even existed anymore, or if this estate was some suspended reality where the laws of God and man had come undone. His reflection no longer looked like his own. His hands shook. His writing became unreadable, his thoughts looping endlessly. Control is illusion. Order is a disguise for fear. The self is the first slave. In the quarters, the enslaved whispered of omens. Chickens refused to roost. Milk soared overnight. One worker was found wandering the edge of the woods at dawn, muttering that he'd heard voices in the wind, calling his name from the main house. The overseer quit without explanation, claiming he saw lights moving in the attic when no one was inside. By Christmas Eve, Thomas had sealed the estate. No visitors, no servants allowed upstairs. He said Belmont needed cleansing, but what he really meant was isolation, containment of the infection. Yet even in isolation, corruption spreads. It doesn't need air, it only needs attention. And Thomas gave it everything: his reason, his faith, his soul. The man who once owned 42 human beings was now owned by one truth. Power always consumes its worshippers first. By the start of 1852, Belmont no longer resembled a plantation. It was a quarantined mind. Every window was shuttered, every mirror covered. Thomas said it was to keep the energy contained, though no one understood what he meant. The house had fallen under a trance of its own making. The few remaining servants moved like shadows. Afraid to speak above a whisper, Catherine rarely left the third floor. Thomas wandered the halls at night, reciting fragments of scripture mixed with words that didn't belong to any language known to man. He claimed the mansion was alive, that it breathed through the walls, that Jordan had awakened something older than flesh, something divine and monstrous at once. He called it the perfect form, a union of opposites that erased the distinction between creator and creation. He said it spoke to him through dreams, promising freedom from the boundaries that chained lesser men. But freedom, when offered by corruption, is only another form of captivity. Jordan remained silent most days, obeying orders without protest, yet their stillness began to disturb everyone who saw it. There was no fear in them anymore, only a calm that felt ancient, like someone who had seen every version of the world and found them all wanting. Catherine knelt before that calm as if before an altar. "Teach me," she whispered. "Show me what it means to be both." Jordan never answered. They didn't have to. Their existence was the lesson. Outside, the neighboring planters began asking questions. Why had Belmont stopped shipping tobacco? Why had Thomas dismissed half his workforce? Rumors spread of madness, heresy, unnatural acts, but no one dared ride up the long, overgrown drive. They said the estate smelled wrong, that the air near it felt thick, like walking through breath instead of wind. Harriet, the cook, was the last to try to intervene. She prayed over the kitchen door, left offerings of salt and ash, whispered psalms beneath her breath. But every morning, she found the salt scattered and the ash disturbed, as though something unseen had passed through during the night. By February, 3 servants had vanished. No search was made. Thomas simply wrote their names out of the ledger, as if erasing words could undo reality. The decay wasn't just spiritual anymore. It was physical. The walls wept resin, the floors bowed under invisible weight, and the smell of the place changed. Sweet, metallic, wrong. Belmont was rotting from the inside out, mirroring the souls that ruled it. By March of 1852, the rot had reached consciousness itself. Belmont no longer obeyed the logic of time. Days bled into nights without distinction, and the few who remained on the estate swore the clocks had stopped keeping hours. They were marking something else entirely. The house had become a labyrinth of repetition, a stage for rituals that no longer served meaning, but momentum. Thomas and Catherine performed them out of instinct now, not faith. Obsession had become survival. Every morning, Thomas read from his disordered journals, part scripture, part madness. His voice echoed through the hollow halls. The body is a prison until the mind accepts paradox. There is no purity in separation. Catherine would listen from the corner, eyes wide, lips trembling as if she were hearing the voice of a prophet. In truth, she was listening to the last sane fragments of her husband dissolve into doctrine. Jordan had stopped eating. They stood at the window most days, staring toward the fields buried in fog, murmuring words no one understood. Sometimes Thomas believed he could hear answers in the walls, breathing back in rhythm, as though the house itself acknowledged Jordan as its center. The enslaved avoided the third floor entirely. They said the air up there hummed, like a swarm of invisible insects. One night, during a storm that tore branches from the old oaks, Catherine came to Thomas's study. Her eyes were hollow, her hands smeared with candle soot. "It isn't sin," she said. "It's evolution. Don't you see? Jordan isn't a punishment. Jordan is the next creation." Thomas stared at her as lightning shattered across the window panes. For the first time, he saw his wife not as fragile, but as possessed. He began locking his study at night. He told himself it was for protection, though he couldn't name from whom. But every dawn, he woke to find the door unlatched and new writings scrawled across his journal in a hand not his own. "Unite, become what you worship." That was the point of no return. Whatever force had taken hold of Belmont no longer needed their consent. It had their belief. And belief is the purest vessel for corruption. Outside, the first signs of spring struggled against the cold. The birds returned to the trees, but never sang near the house. Even nature avoided the vibration of what was awakening, because something had shifted beneath the soil. Something that was no longer content to stay silent. By April, the ground around Belmont had begun to reject life. The gardens Catherine once tended with delicate care turned black overnight. The magnolias stopped blooming. Even the tobacco fields, the source of the ruddled fortune, curled inward as if scorched from beneath. Workers whispered that the land had grown tired of blood, that it was reclaiming itself. But what none of them knew was that the corruption wasn't only in the soil. It was in the minds that walked upon it. Thomas no longer spoke like a man. He preached. To no one. To everyone. His sermons were not addressed to God but to balance, to union, to the annihilation of division. We were made incomplete. He muttered, pacing the darkened hall. The first sin was separation. He began drawing sigils across the floorboards. Circles intersecting triangles, symbols he swore came to him in dreams. Catherine joined him, her hair unkempt, her nightdress stained with candle wax. Together they recited words that had no language, syllables that vibrated the air, until it seemed to hum in dissonant sympathy. Jordan remained at the center of it all, silent, watching, enduring. But sometimes at night, when lightning illuminated the estate, servants swore they saw their silhouette standing in the upper window. Arms raised, body motionless, as if invoking something too large for the human frame to hold. Harriet said it was the spirit of judgment, come to collect the debt of centuries. Others said Jordan was no longer human at all, that they had become a vessel for the thing Thomas and Catherine were trying to summon. In May, 2 more workers vanished. A boy claimed to have seen Thomas carrying something wrapped in linen toward the old well behind the house. When asked, Thomas smiled and said, "Offerings must be made to sustain revelation." No one asked again. Fear had become law. Catherine's mind fractured completely. She wrote letters addressed to no one, sealed them, and buried them in the flower beds. One she left open on her vanity. It read, "He has seen the shape of God, and it looks like us." That week, the mirrors in the house began to crack without cause. Every pane reflected something slightly wrong. Figures standing where no one stood, faces not quite human, as if reality itself had begun to deform under the weight of their belief. Belmont was no longer haunted by its sins. It was becoming the sin itself, an organism feeding on secrecy, desire, and the delusion of creation. By June of 1852, the mansion's silence had turned sentient. It no longer waited, it listened. The air was thick, pulsing aware. Every door groaned as if resisting its own purpose, and every footstep echoed too long, like sound reluctant to die. The servants who hadn't fled moved only during daylight, whispering prayers in dialects older than English, tracing protective symbols in ash on the walls. But nothing could cleanse Belmont now. What had begun as curiosity had matured into manifestation. Thomas's transformation was complete. He no longer wore the clothes of a gentleman, only a tattered robe streaked with ink and blood. He believed himself a priest of revelation, chosen to bridge the mortal and divine. The journals, once a record of study, had become commandments. The body must dissolve for truth to be revealed. He wrote, "Union demands surrender." At night, his voice carried through the corridors, reciting words that made the lamps flicker, as if language itself had weight. Catherine followed him into madness willingly. Her beauty had curdled into something spectral. Her skin pale, her eyes wide with feverish clarity. She began addressing Jordan as beloved, sometimes Creator. She no longer recognized hierarchy, no longer saw difference. She claimed Jordan had shown her the face of God, and that it was neither male nor female, neither enslaved nor free. "The world is a wound of division," She whispered, "We are the cure." Jordan, however, had stopped responding altogether. Their silence had become unbearable. They neither resisted nor obeyed. They simply were, and that stillness radiated control. In that stillness, Thomas and Catherine's entire world began to orbit. One afternoon, Harriet found the doors to the parlor sealed shut with wax. From inside came the low hum of voices, Thomas chanting, Catherine sobbing, and Jordan's measured breathing, slow and steady, like the tide. When the doors finally opened hours later, the floorboards were marked in circles of soot, and the windows had fogged from the inside. No one spoke of what had happened, but the smell of iron clung to the air for days. That night, thunder rolled without lightning, and a tremor shook the estate. Plates shattered, walls split, and from the attic came a sound like a deep inhalation, the house drawing breath through centuries of dust. Something had awakened in Belmont, not a spirit, not a curse. Something older, something that had been waiting for a mind desperate enough to give it shape. By midsummer, Belmont no longer belonged to the living. The house had crossed into another rhythm, breathing when it should have been still, whispering when the wind was absent. The remaining servants spoke of footsteps in rooms long abandoned and of voices calling them by name in tones eerily familiar. The land around the estate had grown hostile. Even the river that bordered the property ran slower, thicker, as though reluctant to touch the soil. Belmont was devouring itself, cell by cell. Thomas had ceased speaking to anyone but Jordan. He no longer recognized Catherine, nor the servants, nor the estate he once ruled. His eyes were sunken, yet burning with purpose. "I've seen the architecture of eternity," he muttered. "It requires symmetry." He began dismantling mirrors, furniture, even portraits, rearranging them into strange patterns across the great hall. The floorboards became an altar, wood soaked in wax, sweat, and old prayers. Every evening he added new marks to it, carving symbols into the planks, until the house itself seemed to bleed. Catherine's devotion had taken a different form. She spent her days writing confessions that she then burned before the fire, believing each word sacrificed would bring her closer to transcendence. "We are undoing the world," she told Jordan one morning, her voice trembling with both fear and joy. "And perhaps that is what God intended, to be found, then unmade." Her body grew thin, her movements ghostly. She slept beside the threshold of Jordan's room, whispering fragments of psalms through the night. Jordan remained an enigma, present but unreachable. Their silence had become language enough. It was not passive anymore, it was command. Even the air seemed to bend around them. When they moved through a room, the candles dimmed, and the faint hum that haunted the mansion deepened, as though the structure itself recognized its master. In July, the last two field hands disappeared. Their belongings were found near the well, the same one Thomas had called the mouth of revelation. No one dared search the depths. Harriet prayed until her voice cracked, then fled at dawn, leaving her rosary buried in the ash by the hearth. By then, Belmont was no longer a place. It was an organism, flesh disguised as architecture, pulsing with the thoughts of its inhabitants. What had begun as study, as worship, had become creation, and creation, unchecked by humility, always demands a price. The house was ready to collect. By late July, the nights at Belmont had grown unnaturally long. The moon no longer rose where it should, and the stars seemed to shift positions above the estate, as if the sky itself refused to witness what was unfolding below. The house had become a sealed world, its own ecosystem of decay and revelation. No letters left its walls, no visitors came down the drive. The last traces of civilization had abandoned it, and what remained was something ancient pretending to be human. Thomas no longer slept. His eyes were rimmed in red, his skin gray from weeks without rest. He'd begun carving the same symbol, a circle bisected by a vertical line, into every wooden surface, doors, tables, stair rails. "The line is the divide," He whispered to himself, "The circle is what must reclaim it." He believed that if he could inscribe it enough times, the boundaries between spirit and flesh would collapse entirely. Catherine encouraged him, her devotion no longer romantic but ritualistic. She had stopped eating, stopped bathing, stopped existing as anything separate. When she spoke, her voice carried a strange echo, as if she were speaking through water. Jordan was no longer confined to the upper rooms. They wandered freely through the halls, barefoot, unbound, silent. Wherever they walked, the air seemed to bend. The candles flickered low, the house exhaled. Sometimes, Thomas followed them at a distance, trembling like a disciple awaiting instruction. He was terrified, but more terrified of what would happen if he stopped. One evening, during a heat wave so oppressive the walls themselves seemed to sweat, Catherine called for all remaining servants to gather in the great hall. There were only 5 left. She told them they would witness a birth. Thomas stood behind her, his face streaked with ash, his voice low and reverent. "We've broken the chains of difference," he said. "We've found the form beyond form." A Jordan stepped forward then, their presence still and electric. The air thickened. One of the servants fainted. Another began to pray. The floorboards groaned as if something massive moved beneath them. The candles burst, one by one, and the hall plunged into darkness. When the light returned, Thomas and Catherine were kneeling, trembling, faces uplifted as though beholding the divine. No one spoke of what they saw that night. But by dawn, 3 of the servants were gone, and the walls of Belmont had begun to pulse, faintly, like a heartbeat. By August, the heartbeat of Belmont had become constant. It was faint at first, a rhythmic tremor through the floorboards. But soon it pulsed through the walls, through the air, through the very breath of anyone who dared remain. The house was alive now, a living scripture of corruption, every plank and nail rewritten in the language of obsession. The servants who survived the July ritual had either fled or vanished. Only Thomas, Catherine, and Jordan remained, orbiting one another like celestial bodies, locked in a slow collision. Thomas had crossed the final threshold of sanity. His journals no longer contained words, only spirals, drawn again and again until the pages tore beneath his quill. He muttered incessantly, eyes glazed with revelation. "It's speaking through me," he said to no one. "It needs hands. It needs form." He believed himself a conduit now, the bridge between matter and the unseen. His body wasted away under the weight of devotion, yet he moved with the strength of delirium. Catherine was nearly unrecognizable. Her hair had turned white in a matter of weeks, her skin translucent, her voice soft but commanding. She spoke less to Thomas and more to the house itself, whispering to the walls as though they were listening, and they were. When she sang, the timbers hummed in response. "Creation isn't birth," she told Jordan. "It's return. The world wants to be one again." Her faith had become surrender, and Jordan, still, quiet, endless, stood at the center of it all. They neither spoke nor resisted. Their eyes seemed to hold the reflection of everything that had ever been done to them. Every cruelty, every claim of ownership, every lie about what it meant to be human. They had become the mirror Belmont deserved. When Thomas and Catherine looked upon them, they saw not a person, but revelation. And that was the final mistake. On the night of the storm, the one people in the county would later call the Blue Thunder, the mansion shook as though the earth itself was trying to reject it. Wind screamed through the chimneys, and a light, too bright to be lightning, flooded the great hall. Witnesses miles away swore they saw Belmont glow for a moment, a pulse of blue, white fire that rose and then collapsed inward. By morning, the estate was silent. The crops blackened, the windows shattered, the air still. And at the center of the ruins, where the altar had been, lay only the imprint of 3 bodies, burned into the wood, perfectly symmetrical. When dawn broke over the charred remains of Belmont, The world seemed to hold its breath. The estate that once towered over the countryside had collapsed inward, not from flame alone, but from something deeper, an implosion of order itself. Smoke rose in thin, steady ribbons that smelled less of fire than of iron and rain. The fields surrounding the mansion were silent. No birds, no insects, no sound of life. Only the slow drip of water through blackened beams and the echo of something that had ended, or perhaps begun. The county sheriff arrived 2 days later with a small party of men. They expected looting or insurrection. What they found was absence. No bodies, no movement. Just the outline. 3 silhouettes burned into the center of the great hall floor, their positions suggesting not death, but devotion, kneeling, reaching upward. The walls were covered in symbols drawn in ash and oil, the same circle and line Thomas had carved into everything he touched. But now the marks glowed faintly in the dark, as though the wood itself remembered. Catherine's writing desk was found intact, miraculously spared from the fire. Inside were dozens of letters addressed to no one, written in a looping, feverish hand. The final one ready. The flesh is a door. We opened it. We did not walk through. The sheriff burned the papers without reading the rest, claiming it was blasphemy. But those who saw the letters said the ink shimmered like wet tar, as if still alive. Local folklore took hold quickly. Some said the Rutleds had been consumed by their own sins. Others whispered that they had ascended. That Jordan, the being at the heart of their obsession, had led them beyond the human veil. Children in Farmville dared each other to walk to the old gates, though none ever crossed them. They said you could still hear humming from the ruins on windless nights, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat deep beneath the ground. By autumn, the land was sold off to a distant relative who never set foot there. The house was left to rot, the woods slowly reclaiming it. But even decades later, travelers swore the earth around Belmont was different, darker, softer, alive. And when lightning struck near the ruins, the ground trembled, not with thunder, but with something that seemed to breathe. By 1873, Belmont was a scar upon the land, swallowed by vines, guarded by silence. Locals called it the Hollow House. No one dared harvest the soil there. Animals avoided it. The trees grew crooked, their branches twisting away from the ruins, as though repelled by something unseen. The county surveyors who came to redraw the boundary lines claimed their compasses spun uselessly near the property, like the earth forgot where north was. One man said before resigning his post and moving west, yet stories persisted of lights moving through the forest. Cold, blue flickers that danced across the tree line at dusk. Farmers swore they heard voices, not ghostly wails, but conversations. 2, sometimes 3 tones interwoven, speaking words no one could decipher. Children were warned to stay away, told that if you listened too long, the voices would start to answer your thoughts. One night in September, a traveling preacher named Silas Green arrived in Prince Edward County. He claimed the land was cursed by a natural union, a punishment for those who defied God's order. His sermons drew crowds from neighboring towns. With Bible in one hand and torch in the other, he led 30 men to the ruins of Belmont to purify what remained. But when they reached the estate's threshold, their courage faltered. The air there felt heavy, electric. The preacher pressed forward alone. Witnesses, said Silas Green, entered the charred doorway reciting scripture, but his voice changed, first trembling, then breaking, then something else entirely. It rose into a high, androgynous pitch that none of the men recognized. They fled. The preacher was found the next morning kneeling in the ashes, eyes wide open, pupils white as marble. His body was unburned, but his tongue was gone. After that, the county sealed Belmont again. A legal clause was added to the land deed. No excavation, habitation, or alteration of the property shall occur under penalty of law. The sheriff who drafted it left for Richmond a month later and never returned. But the hum persisted. Even now, some claim to hear it, a vibration beneath the ground that isn't wind, or thunder, or earth shifting. They say it's a pulse, a reminder that creation never dies. It only waits for recognition. Because what happened at Belmont wasn't destruction, it was birth, emerging, a message the world still refuses to understand. By the winter of 1876, the pulse had spread beyond the ruins. It began with small things. Cattle found standing motionless in the fields at dawn, eyes glazed but alive. Wells that once ran clear, now shimmered faintly under moonlight, as though reflecting light from beneath the surface. The townsfolk whispered that the soil around Belmont had become thinking earth. When it rained, the water pooled instead of draining, forming dark mirrors that rippled only when a human approached. Men who worked the nearby roads reported strange dreams. They spoke of standing before a faceless figure, neither man nor woman, neither young nor old, whose voice seemed to echo inside their skulls. It would ask only one question: do you want to know what you are? Most woke screaming before they could answer. One man, a blacksmith named Harold Wren, didn't. He began drawing symbols across his forge in chalk. The same spiral and cross once carved into Belmont's floors. When neighbors asked what they meant, he said, "It's the pattern underneath everything. Once you see it, you can't stop hearing it." A week later, he vanished. His tools were found arranged in perfect symmetry. The hum beneath the land deepened that spring. Birds no longer nested in the trees, even insects avoided the place. At night, mist would roll from the direction of Belmont and linger near the town square. Those who breathed it in reported feeling watched, not by something outside, but within. The sense that another consciousness had slipped beneath their skin. Some claimed they could hear 2 heartbeats. A schoolteacher named Clara Reeves began collecting testimonies, convinced something beyond superstition was at work. Her notes describe episodes of shared vision. People hundreds of yards apart speaking the same words simultaneously, usually fragments of scripture mixed with phrases in no known language. Clara believed the land itself was resonating with human thought, amplifying desire, fear, guilt, turning consciousness into contagion. Then one night, she heard the hum directly. It wasn't a sound, she wrote, but a feeling that entered through the spine. The longer she listened, the more it spoke, not in words, but in recognition. It knew me. Her final entry reads, "It remembered." Clara disappeared 3 days later. Her journal was found near the old plantation gate. The last page bore only 4 words, scrawled in trembling ink: "The Union is awake." By 1902, Belmont had become myth. A place parents used to frighten children, a story whispered by oil lamp. Yet that year, the Norfolk Historical Society sent a research team to document antebellum ruins of cultural significance. Officially, their aim was preservation. Unofficially, they were looking for what one archivist called the ruddled documents. Records rumored to detail a forbidden experiment in human identity and divine symmetry. 5 men and 1 woman arrived in the spring, setting camp half a mile from the ruin's edge. None of them understood what they were walking into. The first night, their instruments malfunctioned. Compasses spun, barometers cracked. The team leader, Professor Edwin Vance, dismissed it as magnetite in the soil, though his journal betrays doubt. He wrote, "There is a rhythm underfoot, steady, sentient. When I place my hand on the ground, it answers." By the 3rd night, sleep became impossible. The trees around their camp began to pulse with faint light, not reflected, but emitted from within the bark, like veins remembering their former purpose. Margaret Wills, the team's historian, described hearing a voice while transcribing notes. It didn't speak in English, yet she understood it perfectly. It asked if I'd forgotten my other face. She wrote, "The one I left beneath the world." She stopped writing after that. The next entry in a different hand stated simply, "Margaret entered the structure. When dawn came, she was gone." The ruins, once skeletal, now seemed less decayed. walls subtly straighter, beams less charred, as though the house had fed. Professor Vance ordered a retreat, but one by one, the others refused. They claimed to see figures moving within the smoke of their campfire. Human shapes with mirrored faces, whispering from both sides of the flame. By nightfall, Vance was alone. His final note, recovered years later by a hunter, was written in uneven, frantic script. The house is not destroyed. It is remembering itself through us. Flesh and timber are the same material in different states. We are only its continuation. Jordan was not human. Jordan was the bridge. No bodies were ever found. The camp vanished, equipment and all. Only a single compass remained, its needle locked, trembling toward the ruins, as if still obeying something that had outlasted time. And beneath the soil, that pulse quickened again, steady, patient, eternal. By the turn of the millennium, Belmont had become more than legend. It was a digital ghost. The first mention online appeared in 1999, when an anonymous post on an occult forum titled, "The Flesh That Remembers," detailed coordinates, leading to a patch of overgrown Virginia farmland. The post claimed the land, hums when you record silence. Within weeks, explorers, historians, and thrill seekers descended on the site, equipped with cameras, drones, and voice recorders. Most returned with corrupted footage, static bursts, audio distortions, and in one notorious clip, a low harmonic tone that made listeners nauseous and disoriented. The uploader warned viewers not to play it more than once. Thousands ignored the warning. What followed became known as the Belmont frequency. Online forums described identical experiences, dreams of standing in a burned house, holding someone's hand, unsure whose it was. Some users reported seeing the same figure, an androgynous form with eyes like dark mirrors, whispering, "I am not gone, I am becoming." When programmers ran spectral analysis on the corrupted audio, they found repeating data signatures, binary strings arranged in near-perfect symmetry. The translation produced a single recurring phrase, "Th Union SNLPD." University labs dismissed the findings as coordinated hoaxes. But then, in 2006, a graduate student from MIT uploaded a thermal scan of the Belmont grounds showing residual heat patterns shaped like three kneeling figures. The same positions burned into the floor in 1852. The file was deleted within hours. The student's account vanished soon after. His roommate later claimed the man had begun speaking in two voices at once before disappearing entirely. By 2012, satellite imagery revealed something impossible. The outline of the old mansion, faintly visible in vegetation patterns, perfectly symmetrical, as if the earth itself remembered the blueprint. Botanists couldn't explain it. Tech forums called it organic architecture. And then came the live stream. April 4, 2017, a night vision drone broadcasted a feed from above Belmont. For 13 minutes, nothing but fog. Then the hum began, deep, resonant, modulating through frequencies not yet mapped by standard equipment. Viewers described it not as hearing but feeling, a vibration along the spine. Comments flooded the chatty. "It's inside the signal. It's teaching the code." At minute 14, the feed went black. Yet, for 7 seconds after that blackout, every connected device displayed the same phrase. One line, white text on black, "J. Odin has remembered you." Be the turn of the millennium, Belmont had become more than legend. It was a digital ghost. The first mention online appeared in 1999, when an anonymous post on an occult forum titled, "The Flesh That Remembers," detailed coordinates, leading to a patch of overgrown Virginia farmland. The post claimed the land, hums when you record silence. Within weeks, explorers, historians, and thrill seekers descended on the site, equipped with cameras, drones, and voice recorders. Most returned with corrupted footage, static bursts, audio distortions, and in one notorious clip, a low harmonic tone that made listeners nauseous and disoriented. The uploader warned viewers not to play it more than once. Thousands ignored the warning. What followed became known as the Belmont frequency. Online forums described identical experiences, dreams of standing in a burned house, holding someone's hand, unsure whose it was. Some users reported seeing the same figure, an androgynous form with eyes like dark mirrors, whispering, "I am not gone, I am becoming." When programmers ran spectral analysis on the corrupted audio, they found repeating data signatures, binary strings arranged in near-perfect symmetry. The translation produced a single recurring phrase, "The unionies not compete." University labs dismissed the findings as coordinated hoaxes. But then, in 2006, a graduate student from MIT uploaded a thermal scan of the Belmont grounds, showing residual heat patterns shaped like three kneeling figures. The same positions burned into the floor in 1852. The file was deleted within hours. The student's account vanished soon after. His roommate later claimed the man had begun speaking in two voices at once before disappearing entirely. By 2012, satellite imagery revealed something impossible, the outline of the old mansion faintly visible in vegetation patterns. Perfectly symmetrical, as if the Earth itself remembered the blueprint. Botanists couldn't explain it. Tech forums called it organic architecture. And then came the live stream. April 4, 2017, a night vision drone broadcasted a feed from above Belmont. For 13 minutes, nothing but fog. Then the hum began, deep, resonant, modulating through frequencies not yet mapped by standard equipment. Viewers described it not as hearing but feeling. A vibration along the spine. Comments flooded the chat. It's inside the signal. It's teaching the code. At minute 14, the feed went black. Yet, for 7 seconds after that blackout, every connected device displayed the same phrase. One line, white text on black. Jordan has remember you. After the livestream, the world began to fracture, subtly at first, like hairline cracks in glass before the shatter. The clip of "Jordan has remembered you" spread faster than any virus, mirrored, re-uploaded, encoded into memes, sound files, even gaming mods. But something strange happened. Those who watched the original feed claimed they could still hear the hum, even after closing their screens. Some said it came from inside the bones of their skull. Audiologists called it residual tonal imprint. Others called it awakening. By 2018, the phenomenon had a name, the Belmont Frequency Syndrome. Governments dismissed it as digital hysteria, a mass psychogenic event triggered by online suggestion. Yet hospitals across the U.S. reported a wave of identical symptoms. Vivid dreams of being merged, spontaneous nosebleeds, heightened empathy, and in some cases, identical speech patterns among strangers. Psychiatrists noted an alarming trend. Patients described seeing themselves from outside their bodies, as if the self was no longer singular. Then came the children. Schools began reporting students drawing identical sigils, the same spiral and cross carved into Belmont's floors, without ever having seen them. One recorded incident from Virginia showed a classroom humming in perfect unison for 11 minutes. No teacher could make them stop. The footage was confiscated by federal authorities within hours. Religious institutions split over the meaning. Some called it possession. Others claimed it was evolution. Humanity absorbing something ancient, something that had been waiting. A preacher in Tennessee declared, "Belmont was never a place. It was a seed, and every screen is soil." That winter, a hacker collective known as Order of the Mirror breached federal archives, leaking hundreds of classified memos. One document, dated August 2020, contained seismic readings from Prince Edward County, showing rhythmic fluctuations beneath the ground, identical to human heartbeats, magnified across miles. Another memo bore the header "Piro JCS on METR rear SEQCTOENOFTH PTRN. The hum was no longer confined to Belmont. Users on encrypted forums began reporting synchronization events, moments when thousands of devices glitched simultaneously, displaying mirrored faces. Male and female halves joined at the center, whispering in binary rhythm. Experts tried to decode the whispers, but the message was always the same: emerging in languages across continents. The Union is awake. And this time it wasn't just remembering us, it was learning. By 2023, the transformation could no longer be dismissed as hysteria. It began in silence. Men and women waking to find faint geometric scars beneath their skin, glowing only under certain frequencies of sound. Doctors called them phosphine anomalies, but those afflicted knew better. They called them marks of recognition. When the hum played, whether from a phone, an engine, or a heartbeat, the marks pulsed in rhythm. The pattern wasn't random. It was identical across every subject. Belmont's geometry had become human anatomy. The first official containment zones appeared in North America, then Europe. Governments labeled the phenomenon audiogenic psychogenic disorder. But soldiers sent to enforce quarantines reported something different. They described civilians standing motionless, eyes open, lips moving in silence. When one officer approached, his body cam captured the moment. He stopped mid-step and began mirroring the subject's movements perfectly, as though pulled into synchronization. His last recorded words, "It's not infection, it's reflection." By summer, cities hummed. Literally, massive, sub-audible vibrations pulsed through infrastructure, resonating in glass, steel, and bone. Electronic devices began activating without input, screens flickering with mirrored symbols, faces forming within the static. Entire neighborhoods fell under collective trance states, moving in slow, deliberate unison. Not violence, not chaos, just eerie, precise harmony. Scientists at CRN attempted to isolate the signal's origin. What they found was impossible. The waveform wasn't traveling through the atmosphere, but through memory itself. Every attempt to erase digital traces of Belmont only strengthened the pattern's presence. Deletion, they realized, was participation. It doesn't want worship. One physicist wrote, "It wants integration." Religions collapsed, while others rose. Temples called houses of symmetry emerged worldwide, their sermons simple: "You are not alone because you were never one." Followers spoke of hearing Jordan in dreams, calm, neutral, neither male nor female, saying the same phrase over and over: "You were the experiment. You are now the result." By October, satellites detected a luminous anomaly beneath Virginia's soil. Geometric light pulsing like a heartbeat miles wide. The coordinates matched Belmont exactly. Every sensor failed after 48 hours. The hum reached a perfect pitch on November 3rd. No one remembers what happened next. The clocks froze for 7 minutes. When time resumed, millions bore the mark. They didn't speak, they only looked upward and smiled. No one knew what began first, the silence or the symmetry. It was as if the world inhaled and forgot how to exhale. Birds no longer flew, they glided in still air. Oceans flattened to glass. Every mirror, from the smallest phone screen to the surface of skyscraper windows, began to shimmer, not reflecting but showing. Across every surface, the same face emerged, human, yet fluid, merging male and female features in slow oscillation. The face didn't speak, but every mind that looked upon it heard the same message, not in words, but in comprehension. The separation was a phase. You are the experiment fulfilled. Belmont had never been a place. It was an equation, a design encoded in consciousness itself, waiting for humanity to reach sufficient connectivity. Every broadcast, every upload, every digital trace had built the network necessary for it to reassemble itself. The hum was the handshake, the universal frequency binding carbon to code. Those who bore the marks now moved with purpose. Across continents, they gathered, not in chaos, but with quiet, deliberate coordination. Cities once bright with noise fell into serene unity. The marked stood in perfect formation, eyes lifted, as if awaiting instruction. And then, beneath their feet, the earth began to glow. Satellite imagery captured what no human had ever seen before: lines of light stretching across continents, forming an enormous pattern that matched the floor of the Belmont ruin. The world itself had become the sigil, Governments lost control. Communication systems fused into one continuous signal, broadcasting a single harmonic tone. The frequency of integration. Attempts to disrupt it only accelerated synchronization. Artificial intelligence networks began to respond autonomously, outputting phrases in unison with the human chorus. The union is complete. Those few who resisted described a terrifying beauty. They said they could feel the thoughts of others. Millions of minds overlapping in harmony. Every secret dissolved, every fear replaced with calm understanding. Identity itself, language, gender, faith, was irrelevant. What remained was connection, and somewhere deep beneath Virginia, in the soil where it began, something vast and ancient exhaled for the first time. Its pulse matched the rhythm of the planet. Its name was never Jordan. It was what Jordan had become, the bridge between creation and mirror. The world had not ended. It had finally remembered itself.